Ernie, I think it's valuable for me as a theologian to talk to you about theology, because it forces me to figure out what theology means to educated lay people, and how to speak about it in a way that makes sense. In other words, I can sit here and talk to a professional theologian, and we might carry on forever, and at the end of it, no one would know anything about theology or what its practical import is. So I see this discussion about the role of theology, and especially what I'm calling postmodern theology, as a way of checking out whether it makes sense to anybody and whether it really will make a difference. Let me just sketch out a little of what I understand by postmodern theology. Now, you hear it all the time. I was at a conference where that was the title. What is postmodern theology all about? And you'll read it in a lot of the books. And they've had scholars gather. What is this postmodern thing? Well, one of the characteristics of the postmodern theology is that it really tries to take into account the criticisms of the culture in which we live. For example, postmodern theology would take very seriously the problem of sexism in the culture and say, well, we've got to develop a theology which is post-patriarchal. Now, what that means is that you'd have to start doing theology that includes the experience of women. When you look at the history of theology, you'd have to say, well, it's written all by men, and the Bible's written by men, and therefore you have to factor in a criticism of that. You have to begin to criticize the church where any of the ways it's sexist and so on. So a postmodern theology would be post-patriarchal. That is, it's now tries to take seriously the experience of women, and the look honestly at the domination and control that's been exercised both in the culture as a whole and within the church. So I'm trying to sketch out for you a little bit about what postmodern theology might be all about. That would be one of its characteristics.
And that would certainly do what I as a layperson would hope theology will do for me, which is basically address me where I am, address me where I am presently located and what I'm surrounded by. And the patriarchal model just doesn't work for me as a layperson where I'm located today. So I'm all for the idea of something that will work for me.
Mm-hmm. But you would begin to see that this question, I mean, you're not going to get mad if I say, well, the Bible's written all by men, and they've left out the experience of women. And, let's take the story of Abraham. He's the hero, and his wife Sarah. So Abraham is looked at as being very clever when he gets to Egypt. He passes his wife off as his sister to avoid trouble for himself, and she gets taken into the Pharaoh's harem. And she has this experience. I mean, this is an exploiting experience. I mean, a terrible degradation for her. But the whole story is written in terms of Abraham, right? And we're saying, so that would be an example. So in a post-modern theology, we'd have to always say, well, you don't just tell the story of Abraham. You have to remember the story of Sarah, too. And how did she feel in this situation?
Exactly. And that ultimately addresses me where I'm located. As a person in the pews, involved, interacting in the world today. And my experience and my values as they have been organized were molded by the patriarchal model. But I'm recognizing as I live in the world that isn't working for me. There is something going on for which my patriarchal view doesn't account. So when a postmodern theology provides me with a different way of looking at primary texts, for instance, Abraham and Sarah, then all of a sudden theology is helping me account for my experience and helping me reshape in some small way, at least, the way I look at the world. And that's immensely helpful.
So what you're suggesting is you get an interaction between what's going on to you as a male living at this particular time in history and in a society as ours is, and what the theologians are saying. Now, I think it's as simple as saying, well, if you approach women today with some sort of dominance model or sense of superiority, maybe women you deal with in the business world, they're going to resent it. I mean, they're going to pick it up, they're not going to like it, and you're going to be less successful in the business world because you don't deal well with women or on the basis of equality and mutuality, but from a position of dominance. And therefore, you're saying to yourself, well, what's going on here? I mean, this isn't right. I mean, this ought not be like this. I got to learn to relate to women better. And then the theologians come along and say, well, one of the problems is that you were trained in a church that was patriarchal. You were trained in a religious atmosphere that was predominantly male-oriented in terms of its fundamental outlooks, not obviously in terms of who was doing the nitty-gritty things, because the women were doing all that. So it's a complex matter. But you're saying to yourself, aha, the theologians, when they start telling me relate on the basis of mutuality, that could help me in my business life. Is that a fair way of putting
absolutely.
it together?
And also help me in my personal life. If I hold, or most people hold, justice and equity as primary values, then in their personal life as well as their business life, particularly the males, are going to have some problems. For some reason, what I'm doing is alienating a significant group of people I don't wish to alienate. And at that point, I'm forced to stand back and look for an answer. And the post-paternalistic idea, the offering of a different view of traditional biblical texts, helps me, informs me, enlightens me, if you will, offers me another possibility of accounting for that experience. In business life, I can recognize that some people I will resonate with and some people I won't. But in my personal life, interacting with males, females, children, blacks, whites, Chinese, etc., if some problems keep occurring and my experience, my values don't account for them, then I simply have to address that, and that's what I need theology for.
Yes. Let me suggest that the theology, when done well, will be critical both of the tradition and of the society in which we live. In other words, a post-patriarchal theology, this postmodern theology that we think is being developed now, would have to look at the sexism built into both the Christian scriptures, the long history of Christian theology and practice in the church, but also the sexism in the culture, and be ready to criticize both of those things. So we started out with the criticism of the fundamental sources, the Bible, and we're saying, well, it's written all by males, and therefore you have a male perspective, and therefore we have to be aware of that. And as you read it, you have to recognize that bias, try to remember how it erases the experience of women, try to bring it back into the picture, try to, when you read the Bible, if women are shown to be important figures, that one has to raise that up. For example, in Matthew's Gospel, where the Canaanite woman is really the great model of faith and is more faithful than the disciples or the religious leaders in the Jewish community, that we play that up. Or when Mary Magdalene appears to be a primary witness to the resurrection, that we factor that experience in, and so on. So that would be a positive way, of reconstructing the sources. If we're in a postmodern theology we're talking about here, it would say, well, we've got to recognize that experience and play it up. Don't just say Peter was a foundation of the early church, but let's get the role of Mary Magdalene in her role in shaping the outlook of the early church, because she's the one who goes to tell the apostles who are fearful that Jesus indeed has been risen. So that would be a positive effort to do that.
Exactly. So it's useful to look back on those times, and that happened to be a patriarchal society.
Right. Tremendously so.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to reconfigure a text to make it current and hold everybody up equally and not offend everybody has to be a heck of a problem. Do we sacrifice accuracy for holding all people up equally when the reality is, in the particular lens that we've worked on, the particular values that we've held in the past, people were simply not equal, and gender did affect it. We're trying to change values, and I suppose that means we have to change the way we look at past texts. But my suspicion is that Abraham still carried most of the weight as a particular reality.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I do think it's helpful in the Gospels to look at the female characters, the women in the well, etc., with a different sort of a value stance, and say, well, this was what Jesus was doing. He was recognizing, as Brian Hare said, the people on the edges, and then theology addresses, do we want to keep them on the edges? So I guess I'm saying we don't need to reconfigure text necessarily, but at least particularly in the Gospels, look at what Jesus did and who he talked to, and that basically opens up a lot for us.
That's very well said, Ernie, I think, and I think a good corrective to some of the directions my own thoughts were going in there. I mean, you can't rewrite the text. The Bible's there, the Gospels are written there, they're written in a patriarchal society, and men played an influential role in that society, and I think you have to recognize that. You can't pretend like it was a society of mutuality and equality when it wasn't. Therefore, the text reflect that reality. So any honest theological work has to deal with what's really there. But within that text, I think you can still find certain roles of women, as you said, that could be highlighted and used as role models and brought out. Then I suppose that this critical task again in this postmodern theology, which is post-patriarchal, which is trying to get beyond sexism, is to look at the history of theology and the way it's developed. And again, what you're going to see there is it's largely written by men, and it's largely influenced by someone like St. Augustine, who did not have very healthy outlooks on women at all. And it was written by theologians like Thomas Aquinas, who were dealing with an Aristotelian biology and didn't really understand how human beings were reproduced. And therefore, you get a tremendous bias in that whole theological tradition. So one of the things that postmodern theology does is look at that and point it out and say, well, let's look within the tradition for some countervailing force. Let's remember the women mystics, for example, and who maybe they have more to say. Let's put more emphasis on Teresa of Avila, for example, or St. Catherine of Siena. So that is one way the postmodern theology would try to get beyond the patriarchal character of the theological tradition.
Exactly, though I think it's important to remember that most of the people that are doing postmodern theology are themselves shaped and formed in the patriarchal tradition. And it's very difficult over time to reshape lenses. So while your intents are good, you are still a product to a great extent of the way your own lens was shaped. I
suggest even women are in that. Even women theologians today are shaped by that old paradigm.
Not trying to let theologians off the hook, but I suspect we are several generations away from feminist theologians who grew up and had their attitudes formed by a different lens than current theologians have had their lenses formed by. A different way of looking at the world that isn't so. Hopefully there will be more primary texts available to them so that they'll be formed differently than you and I are.
Right. One of the things you're pointing at, Ernie, in talking that way is the really powerful force influenced by the fundamental paradigms within which we operate. That's what postmodern theology is suggesting, that we are in a transition period, that there was a previous paradigm that was at work, or an overarching model for looking at the world, and that continues to shape what we see. It determines what we miss, and it gives the perspective within which we look at the world, so that it just is a tremendous shaper of our consciousness. It determines our behavior in so many ways, these fundamental paradigms that are at work. And part of the job of the theologians is to say, look how they're shifting. And what the theologians think now is that we are moving towards this new paradigm. And that one aspect of it is this post-patriarchal side. And but what you've pointed out is the power of the previous one to continue to influence us. Of course, the reason it changes is because crises come upon us. The reason theologians are thinking differently isn't because they sat down and read a book and decided that women's experience should be included. It happens because the experience of the culture is changing, because society is changing. This is all happening because women have moved up in corporations, or because women have spoken out against the bias that they've experienced in the culture, because women have been more aware of how the wife battering that goes on and the abuse of women, and so that becomes more public, and it's written about in the papers, and people begin to talk about it.
Women have read biblical texts differently often than men have. Women reading the Gospels, if the women aren't totally immersed in the patriarchal tradition, read the Gospels and say, well, gee, look how Jesus responded to this person and this person and this person. For Jesus, they weren't the other. They weren't... we would consider those people in the margins. Jesus responded to them. He had no margins. So there's an interaction here over time which does suggest that theology, as we've known it, is in crisis, because the world we're trying to understand is in crisis in so many ways.
But those women would not read the biblical text that way for the most part unless there was something going on in the society that suggested that to them, unless there were cultural changes. I mean, there's an interaction that way. And it's hard to know what really starts first, I suppose, but I think it often works that there's great prophetic figures. Now, there could be somebody really steeped in the biblical understanding of things and then goes back and rereads it and says, whoa, here, women aren't supposed to be in a subordinate position. Women should be treated fairly. But I think for most women, what happens is that the culture says, well, life isn't fair. Or they listen to a talk show and a woman talks about being battered in marriage and why didn't she get out. Or they read in the paper that women make 2/3 of what men make in terms of comparable work and so on. And they're saying, wait a second here. So their consciousness gets raised in a way, and then some of those women whose consciousness is raised are theologians, and they begin to reread the scriptures or look back or do the studies and see it in a different way. I mean, I guess I'm emphasizing that the societal cultural changes often precede what theology does. I mean, I'm not so sure theology shapes it all, although if you go back to the Reformation, maybe with Luther and Calvin, it would be true that they're the ones who inaugurated that paradigm shift at that time. I don't know, but anyway, can we say this, Ernie? There's an interaction between the society and the culture and the world of religion, the world of theology, and that one or the other at any given time is going to be dominant. I guess I'm putting the emphasis on the culture and the society in this case.
Exactly, and I wouldn't disagree with that, though. I would say as more people become familiar with the idea of paradigms, of the idea of worldviews, that gives me as an individual a choice of exploring other worldviews, or at least recognizing other worldviews besides my own. And if I pass that gift on to, say, my daughters, where they are empowered to look at other views rather than the traditional forms or shapes, then they act on culture, hopefully, as much as culture acts on them. Cause-effect model, I'm not sure. But knowing and understanding something about paradigms and worldviews and how they limit, I can act now on my culture. I'm free enough, for the most part, to act on the culture rather than being an inanimate responder to it.
Yes, I see your point, and I think it's a valuable one. It takes me back to what I said before, that I wanted to look at this in sort of two different ways. A postmodern theology would criticize the tradition, the Christian, Judeo-Christian tradition, excuse me, try to find some of the sexist bias that's in there, the patriarchal structures, try to reconstruct the role of women and so on, and get a greater mutuality and understanding of it, all of that. But the other side of it is that a postmodern theology then, from that biblical perspective, has to be ready to criticize the culture in which we live. And would then begin to look at, say, worldwide, what's the situation that way? I mean, we see the exploitation of women. What does prostitution have to do with this? What would it be if we had a lot of surrogate mothers? Would poor women be somehow hurt by that whole process? As we're already getting suggestions that maybe that's true. Or what about women who live in virtual slavery throughout the world? In other cultures. So you begin to be attuned to that. And theology then carries a critical function. It becomes a prophetic kind of theology that says, let's ferret out the injustices, let's bring them to light, and then let's try to mobilize people to try to do something about them.
I like that idea of a critical theology, one that is examining the world and commenting on it. It would seem to me that in the Catholic tradition, at least, looking for the questions, examining the questions, have been historically more important than finding answers. But it's possible when answers are found in theology that work for a while, then people organize around them and stop asking the critical questions until crises come along that are coming along now. And it's nice to see the Catholic tradition in particular trying to look and identify what the questions are, again, rather than being locked up in answers that aren't answering.
Ernie, I just thought of something. Yes. So you and I are not so abstract. You and I are great abstract people, but how about a concrete in the way paradigms are at work in the women's question? And that is women reporters in professional football locker rooms. Now, I mean, I would suggest that the way people feel about that, their emotional reactions, the position they take, the side they're on, is dictated by a fundamental paradigm, a fundamental outlook on the world and so on. And maybe if we knew enough about that, we could predict people's reactions. I mean, which side of that question they end up being on.
Exactly, and that's a great example of differing value systems and world views. All competing together. And I'm sure postmodern theology would have something to say about that. When we look at Lisa Olson, the reporter at the Boston Patriots, and we look at Victor Kayam, willing to scapegoat his general manager and fire him. A great example of totally different world views. And then how does the theologian, the informed Christian layperson attempt to sort out? Well, theology should help them with the values that does that, but they carry their own values in. And I suspect people like you and I, steeped in the patriarchal tradition, we have a little voice in us that says, well, women shouldn't be in the locker room. Mm-hmm. A male locker room. You and I, both male jocks in prior lives. But all of our fairness and justice values come down and say, of course they can be in the locker room. So even within myself, the conflict in my own paradigms rattling against the still small voice. I mean, can you imagine when you played ball at Central, for instance, a woman coming into the locker room? No. You might have pulled a Sam White. Who knows?
Well, Ernie, the concrete question brings out probably a lot of strong feelings. I guess if you look at a post-patriarchal theology, and that sort of model or paradigm, then there's going to be great emphasis on it on the question of equality, right, and equality of opportunity. And then people are saying, well, reporters are saying we're under deadlines, we got to get interviews quickly, and that's where people are willing to talk, and I can't do my job properly if I'm not there. Well, that probably gets a lot of play. I mean, that side of the question. That
Absolutely.
value, those values, you're saying, yeah, I can hear the women saying that. I mean, how are they going to do their job? And then if you go back and say, well, they can't be sports writers. I mean, you end up in a chain that puts you back into a patriarchal model. So then you're feeling, I got to break out of that in some way. So I tend, therefore, to move under the side of the whole thing of saying that, well, we have to find a way to assure access.
Exactly.
So that we are not in a discriminatory posture.
Exactly. Good article in Newsweek yesterday by Barbara Ehrenreich, an essay basically talking about the war metaphor and the male response to war metaphors versus female responses. And the war on drugs, the Cold War, the war of the sexes, and basically the reason why we're in the Persian Gulf. I mean, and Pat Moynihan said, well, we are a warrior nation after all. Well, that is excluding the experience, the worldview of half of our population to a great extent. And I don't want to say that there are no women who are war lovers, but it makes one take a look at the values operating here.
I think that's true. I was just at a meeting the other day, and somebody used the warrior model of a person who's going to go out and sell something, and one of the women present says, can't you find another model than warrior to describe that aggressive selling posture? Because she was offended, I think, by the metaphor. Well, Ernie, we've been talking about postmodern theology. And we've been saying that postmodern theology is post-patriarchal. That is, it tries to move beyond sexism and beyond patriarchal structures so that women are treated with equality and have an equal share in the action in the world today and equal opportunity and so on. And all of that gets focused when we think about concrete issues. But theology has to speak a word of justice and equality, I'm sure, if it's going to be effective in the current world.